Hello and welcome back. And that's right, if you're watching this video, chances are you're doing it because you have got your brand new network attached storage solution of small or big scale. You've lumped on 10 GBE or maybe you had 10 gig out the door, but yet you're not getting 10 gig speeds. Me and Eddie at NAS Compares here, we've been running support sections around this YouTube and the website for a better part of 5 years. And I would say hands down, the most common issue people have encountered is having a 10 gig NAS and not getting 10 gig speed. In other words, 1000 megabytes per second, 1024. Don't be that guy in the comments. But basically 1 gigabyte per second performance. And in this video, I've correlated all of the solutions, resolutions, and answers to issues that we've ever encountered to try and cover as many ways to resolve your 10 GBE network performance issue as possible. So let's roll up our sleeves and get started. We've got a lot to cover in this video, but let's get the most obvious one out of the way. Having a NAS that has 10 gigabit Ethernet on the rear simply opens up the bandwidth. It opens up the channel, the pipe if you will, to 1000 megabytes per second, or again, 1 gigabyte per second there. But you're only opening up the pipe. It's up to you to push through that water, as it were. Now, for this, if you have a system populated with hard drives, you are going to need lots of these to saturate 10 GBE. Most traditional hard drives that use SATA will give you between 160 and about 270 to 280 megabytes per second. There are exceptions to the rule. There's certain SAS drives that go higher, and indeed drives that have got 2 or 3 actuators inside that result in doubling or tripling the performance of the average drive. But when it comes to pretty much all drives, you're going to need at least 4 to 5 drives, realistically more, in a RAID configuration to allow a greater degree of read and write across all of the drives simultaneously to saturate a 10 GBE connection there. But again, I will say it's very dependent on the number of drives, the class of the drives, and the RAID configuration you choose to use. Certain RAID configurations like RAID 0 or RAID 10 give you the largest performance, but they also come with larger downsides. Again, that's for another video. But if you were running a system that's, for example, a 4-bay system, like some of these here on the table, and they either have 10 GBE or you've added 10 GBE, 4 hard drives is very rarely going to fully saturate a 10 GBE connection, and that's where you'll need to consider things like SSDs. 4 SSDs in a RAID 5 environment should, in theory, saturate a 10 GBE connection. It will come down to the block size there, but overall, again, getting the most obvious one out of the way, hard drives, you're going to need more. You're probably 5, closer to 6, really. Continuing on that subject of media, what if your NAS system like this one, this is the Link Plus Link Station N2, is all SSD and it has a 10 GBE port there on the rear? Why on earth would that, with so much SSD performance inside, not saturate a 10 GBE connection? Well, let's delve into it. Number one, this system here, the M.2s inside, are at Gen 3 times 1. Now, Gen 3 times 1, although it is listed as a gigabit, really in terms of performance, or a gigabyte I should say, that does still mean you're only going to get around about 800 to 900 megs on a 3 times 1 lane, realistically, and that's megabytes. Now that means that even though an SSD like this one, the Samsung 980 Pro, which is a Gen 4 times 4 drive, promoting speeds of 7 gigabytes per second in read, it is not going to be able to outstep that 800 megs on each individual M.2 there, and even the PCIe switch they are fed into there. Ultimately, if you do have a system that has PCIe M.2 NVMe SSD slots inside, double check via the terminal or via SSH and something like PuTTY, find out the PCIe lane distribution and find out what the speeds are that may have been downgraded to on SSDs inside your NAS there. Again, we'll put the command in the description below. And following up on that, Not all SSDs, particularly M.2 NVMEs in 2025, are built equally. We have ones like this one, which look very different. Look at all that plastic there, that PCB. The reason is, this doesn't have any DRAM on board. This is a DRAM-less SSD, it has no memory on board. That means that this SSD relies on something called HMB, or host memory buffer. And if you are using slightly more affordable SSDs like this one, which are made more affordable due to having less hardware on the board, the result can often be that these become oversaturated phenomenally quickly because they are overly reliant on the cache of the system they are in, and they get very hot very quickly, which can also lead to throttling. The result is that if you are running a NAS system that has HMB required drives or DRAM-less SSDs inside, you are going to see that potential 10 GBE performance throttled quite early doors, particularly in RAID environments where you have multiple of these drives working together. You would not believe how often people actually make this mistake. Double check that your switch actually is 10 GBE. Now, a lot of this is not the fault of people that are buying these really, it's the presentation of some switches on the likes of Amazon. Even B&H sometimes doesn't really stay on top of their descriptions a lot. You'll see a switch online that will say 10 gig SFP switch, $50, $60. And then when you get it, you find out that 1 or 2 of the ports are actually 10 GBE and the rest are not. Again, it can often be, those in the more tech-verse world will understand that, but more often than not, you will buy a switch where they put 10 GBE front and center there at the beginning of the description, and you are unaware that it only applies to very selective ports on the switch. And therefore, you might be connecting the device and not realizing that maybe this port here going off into your NAS or this port here going into your client machine, one of them actually isn't 10 GBE, and you've inadvertently created that bottleneck yourself. Now let's say you're running your benchmarks, you're running iPerf, you're running Atto, you're running DD, whatever it is that you're going to be doing to test and benchmark your system. For some reason you are getting some weird numbers where you're not getting low 100 meg speeds, but you're not getting your 1 gigabyte speeds there. Let's talk about the bits in the middle there, not just the switch either. Now, for example, when it comes to network cabling, if you're going to run 10 GBE, do not use anything less than Cat6 cables. The reason being, Cat6 cables are designed for longer distances of maintaining that high performance. On smaller distances, you can get away with Cat5, but I would still never recommend it. And if you are running or upgrading an existing network that you've got in your home or business, and a lot of the cabling is already in the walls, double check and find out what the cabling is, because if you're running less than Cat6, that can often lead to drops of 50 to 100 to even 200 megs depending on distance. 10 to 20 meters is generally the rule of thumb when it comes to upgrading cables, and you can always find out on cabling what the generation of the cable is because it's printed on the cables. If the cable you've got does not have the Cat rating written on the side, just assume it's Cat5. And likewise, you fiber users, don't think you're off the hook either. Some of you might be utilizing systems where you're using converters. I've talked about these before. This is a Sodolo converter. I think Unify also have a good range of them themselves. And these convert SFP or fiber into traditional copper there. Some of these are not as good as they sound, and often some of them, they actually get overheated exceedingly quickly, or by default will have speeds less than 10 gig. Now that doesn't just extend to the converters. We can look at this one. This is an SFP adapter here, and this goes straight in. This is a transceiver, I should say. And this goes in here, and this allows me, to start putting in my 50, 100 meters of fiber channel there. But this is rated at 1 gig. This isn't a 10 gig adapter. The price difference between a 10 gig transceiver, I should say, not adapter, and 1 gig can often be very complex because a lot of the fiber output there, the pricing is not as easy to follow as 10 GBE on copper. You can get 1 gig adapters that cost even more than entry-level 10 gig adapters. It can be very confusing. Double check what your SFP transceivers are first. MTU, or jumbo frames, is a term that most users outside of a slightly more techie silicon paste under the fingernails will know about. Ultimately, when you're exchanging any data over 10 GBE, 1 GBE, 100 gig Ethernet, you are going to be doing so in certain packet sizes, and by default this is set to 1500 bytes there. Now that means that each packet is being handled every single time, and you can increase that up to, on 10 GBE, up to 9,000, and the majority of network adapters in Windows, Mac and NAS providers allow you to adjust this either within the GUI or over terminal via SSH based commands. That means that you can actually increase the size of the average packet there to 9,000 bytes, and that means for lesser resource utilization as data is being handled in larger segments. Now it's worth highlighting this won't resolve it for everyone. Depending if you're using something like NFS or SMB, some of them have their own overarching protocol to start with. Also, your data size may not even be a case of needing this kind of adjustment, but a lot of the time if you are looking at testing your 10 GBE at the very least and you're getting speeds maybe at 700 to 800 when you're hoping to get 1000, then try to play around with the jumbo frames. But keep in mind you have to change the MTU/jumbo frames at both ends. You have to go into the switch management panel and ensure that that individual port is set to 9000, and make sure that on the host system it is set, because if there is any bottleneck there between the two of them, if one of them is at 1500 for example, it will immediately truncate it down to 1500 regardless. Have you enabled encryption? This is another one that gets often overlooked, particularly when you're setting up your NAS for the first time and the NAS is shouting at you, you should use encryption, you should use encryption, you should use encryption. Whether that is inline or just as the data comes back and forth, encryption does have an overhead there, and it can result in, even though you've got a system that is ready to encrypt the data and you've got a system that is ready to send the data, there needs to be some packaging in the middle, and much like a traffic jam, when you've got a red light that's really intermittent and goes on for a little bit too long and then you'd like, you end up with queuing here happening in the middle as data is being encrypted by the host system. This can often lead to, particularly when you are running larger scale files consistently, so this is a high volume and high frequency transfer, can result in diminished 10 GBE performance. And again, use something like AJA where it will give you a nice graphical interface there where you can actually see the dip in oversaturation over time. This is particularly true if you use SSL protected transfers, or if you're going to be using something like iSCSI and you're going to use an iSCSI initiator to mount kind of raw pure storage. A lot of the time they use things like CHAPS, CHAPS, that protects a lot of that file data and authentication back and forth, but also results in an enormous drag factor. Again, having the system to keep up is going to be crucial. And talking of having a system to keep up, this is by and large for me one of the biggest cons in the world of NAS, and I try to talk about it every single time I have a video on this very subject. And what is that? Well, it is the NAS CPU. Do you know there are NAS systems out there that you can pick up where we've got 10 GBE on board for about 250 to 300 nicker, and you're thinking, bish bash bosh, that sounds great. And I'm looking at you, QNAP, more than anyone else. You've got solutions out there that have got 10 GBE plastered on the side, but you're running them on ARM or ARM-based processors there. Now, these are not great for high volume or high frequency, or indeed both, transfers there. And the result is that although they do make a point on their product pages to show performance numbers where you clearly see write performance is absolutely horrific, it still means that a lot of users will go ahead. I hate seagulls. I don't know if they got picked up on the mic. Hopefully this new mic cuts that out. But you end up with a system where on the QNAP, for example, that you would have 4, 6 or even 8 bays of hard drive storage there, which traditionally should saturate at 10 GBE, but the CPU in the middle is acting as a tremendous bottleneck, even without encryption, even without any kind of authentication protocol in the middle slowing things down, because the CPU is designed to take instruction, compress it down so it utilizes less power to do so. That's how a lot of these mobile processors and ARM-based mobile do the job, and then hand over the task. The result is that even though you're running some high-end PC system and you're running some high-end storage media, the very CPU inside the system is being problematic. So to avoid this, always, for 10 GB at least, look at x86 based processors. And in particular, if you are looking at some of the more efficient Alder Lake or Twin Lake processors rolling out at the moment in the N100, N305, N355, N150 processors. These are all good and well, and some of them have got 10 GBE on board, but keep in mind that these processors have a very limited lane count and are designed around efficiency, and more often than not, they will only assign ×1 lane speeds to 10 GBE. You might get lucky with ×2, but then you end up having it kind of diminished with controllers around the motherboard as well. So keep that in mind. CPU is crucial. So let's say you've got a really good CPU, you've got good storage media inside, you've got 10 GBE slapped on the rear of the NAS, and you've got 10 GBE slapped on your host client system, and a 10 GBE switch that's opened up to MTU, but you're still not getting 1 gigabyte per second performance. Well, unfortunately, this can often be attributed down to a very poor SATA controller inside. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm looking at you, J Micron. There are controllers out there that are inside your NAS system that are designed exclusively for the management of all of the connected drives. Now, each one of the ports that these drives are sliding into, those SARs, may be SATA 3, which is 6 gigabits per second there. All fair and well. And even though the drive inside is only going to give you a few hundred megs, that still should be pretty darn good. However, all of these are being fed into a controller inside. Once again, this is where our friend Terminal and SSH and something like Putty to dig in tells us more. Certain controllers inside, again, as Media and Marvell have produced some of them as well that are a bit ropey, but particularly some of the JM Micron ones, these are SATA controllers where they feed in and they've been placed on a single 5 gigatransfers ×1 lane. Sometimes this can give you between 2.5 gig and 5 gigabit internal connectivity there. Now, these little RAID controllers inside will end up meaning that even if you took this 4 bay and populated it with SATA SSDs, and in the hope you should be getting at the very minimum 650, 700 megs, you might have a controller in the middle, that RAID controller, that is immediately throttling all performance from those drives through it down to 250 meg to maybe 500 megs. Again, I know it goes up to about 550, 570, but nonetheless, this can all result in a bottleneck that comes down to a small component inside your system. So do take the time to find out before a purchase, or maybe even afterwards, what is the SATA controller inside your system. Very few graphical user interfaces, GUIs, will show you that. So you are going to have to go into Terminal. Again, I'll put some command in the command line you can use that is non-intrusive or non-changey that you can use to find out what exactly the SATA controller in your system is. PCIe lane sharing inside a system is a bigger problem than you might think. And again, this comes down to a lot more efficient processors in the market as well, which are forcing manufacturers to try to really carve up the available PCIe lanes available from a certain CPU in a system to keep it affordable, but still give it a lot of feature set there. Now, again, massive hats off to Hardware Haven. They did a fantastic review of this device over here. It's just off camera there. That is the Zimmer Cube, the original one. And what was highlighted when he was doing his deeper testing, he noticed that a lot of the NVMe and the SATA controllers were all being fed into a single PCIe lane controller that was massively bottlenecking everything going through the system. And the result was that even though it looked more than capable to output a gigabyte per second there, the performance numbers just kept hitting a cap at 600 or so megabytes per second there, just under. Now, a big part of that was that even though you've got all these feature sets, they're all feeding into very modest PCIe switch controllers there in the middle. Another great example is this. This is the QNAP QM2 card. I talk about these on the channel. The newer generation of these are really, really good, I will say. They are built on Gen 3 and even Gen 4 architecture, some of them there at ×4, ×8, and even a ×16 card as well. But some of the first generation cards which are still out there, these, for example, this one that has got 2 x M.2 NVMe and a 10 GBE card, this is on a Gen 2 ×4 PCIe. That is not a lot to play with. That's at most 2 gigabytes per second to play with there. And that has been shared against 2 M.2 NVMe's and that 10 GBE there. That's insane. And if you have that inside your system, if you have even one SSD in that system, you're sharing it with the 10 GBE. And chances are when it comes to that 10 GBE output being shared through there, it's going to end up being carved out. The point I'm making is double check the PCIe distribution of your system. Again, Terminal, SSH, Putty. to find out just exactly what the layout of those controllers are inside, because it will help you understand where potential bottlenecks are. Sorry to sling in a couple more really obvious ones, but I realised I didn't include them in the introduction. Number one, double check your switch has not capped any of the ports. It seems really stupid, but a lot of the time when you do get network switches, it's very easy when creating VLANs and then removing VLANs along the way. You'll create little subnetworks there, and you don't realise that by default, you have created one that's got a lower priority of service or lower quality QoS or PoS. And the result is that all the devices within those individual physical bonded ports have now got a capped performance on them. So go into your network switch and check each port one by one and ensure there is no limitation set to those ports. Another really obvious one, again, drivers. I cannot believe in 2025 right now, we are still having systems rolling out with 10GBE on board without the drivers by default. You'll be amazed how often I've spoken to people that have got a NAS that isn't outputting 10GBE, and it's turned out that the brand in question has put the driver, the most optimal updated driver for 10GBE NICs on their system, in the app center and not installed by default there. And the same goes, by the way, for your client hardware, but at least it makes sense. Windows, for the majority, produce the software, not the hardware. So I can kind of understand why you would need to go elsewhere to get the driver. But when it comes to the physical NAS, double check that the 10GBE driver is installed. You'll be amazed how often that isn't actually there. If you're a Windows user, you can take advantage of something called receive side scrolling, or RSS, that will allow you to use more of the cores of the CPU inside your Windows system and therefore have a better management of 10GBE processing via, incoming or outgoing traffic there. This is another setting that could be enabled on the command line, but you can do it on PowerShell on your PC desktop. And likewise, if you are running a system that perhaps has a mobile quality to it, perhaps it has a power saving mode, there is a potential that it is impacting the network command there. So what you can do is go in again, PowerShell, a setting called EEE, Energy Efficient Ethernet, and you can disable that, which may have been left on during a power on, power off, or maybe you're running off battery at one point that may be throttling your network output there. So just make sure that setting is turned off when you're running on a mains power outlet to ensure that this isn't capping your bandwidth there for energy efficiency reasons. Another really obvious one, I know, but do take a moment to look at the task manager of your machine, your client machine, and that of the NAS, and find out if there is any background processes that are hampering things, whether that is on the NAS side, that they're utilizing CPU resources, or even then that there is utilizing disks and accessing disks, and therefore kind of leveraging away some of the performance that should be going directly towards internal and external network traffic. But nevertheless, again, it's a very small thing to check out, and almost certainly, depending on the NAS brand you go for, the actual processes that are listed to show you what's going on will differ. Something like a QNAP actually lists a lot of the individual processes and allows you to monitor them or kill them one by one. Other brands, unfortunately, allowing, to stop using to stop users from interfering with the system and harming its abilities, will often cap the ability to cancel or at least delay or disable certain processes one by one. For those, again, you're going to have to maybe get your hands dirty and go into SSH. I don't recommend you do that unless you know what you are doing, but nonetheless, take a look at those background processes. Another really dumb, obvious one, double check that there isn't anything else on the network that is pinging the NAS when you're trying to access it. You'll be amazed how often people don't realise that another device on the local area network, for one reason or another, is hitting the NAS. It could be something really overt, like someone else accessing a file, or even background stuff where one user who you are unaware of is having backups from their phone onto the system that they're not even aware are going on. So just, again, it sounds really obvious, double check that there isn't another device on the local area network that is utilizing the NAS in some way that is harming the output because the drives are busy doing something else. And this last one is one that we have seen more and more as users have been moving out of their standard bedroom ISP router NAS setup into 1 or 2 switches dotted around, and that is subnets. You'd be amazed how often users who are taking advantage of 10GBE switches are running the NAS and their client system on an ever so slightly different subnet. And by that I mean that maybe their IP of their NAS is 192.168.1 and 100, and their client machine on the other hand is 192.168.2 or 0, or just ever so slightly different. Now, the result is that the NAS will still appear on the local area network. They'll use something like Advanced IP Scanner or something like that, or even proprietary network scanning tools from the NAS brand, and the NAS will appear. However, they may be accessing the NAS through the router or through the wrong switch, or it might be that there is a double up there on the IP that is being listed, and therefore it's using the lowest one. By that, what I mean is that you may be accessing the NAS that you are accessing directly physically in a 10GBE connection to a 10G switch, and the 10G switch is connected into the 10G NAS, but because you might have another switch in the network environment or a router that has that other subnet that you may have graduated away from, the result is that your client machine will be talking through the switch into the router and then back into the NAS. That can result in a tremendous bottleneck there, so make sure that you are on the same subnets. And again, just like the other points, in the description below, I've listed different commands that you can utilize to check the IP route that you are passing through when accessing the NAS on your client machine. I'm sorry that a lot of these points below, by the way, are based on Windows architecture, hopefully, because I'm looking more at command line. Your OS of choice shouldn't be too much of a factor, but it's just the easiest, clearest way to see it that works for both Windows and Mac environments. But there you go, those are a massive handful of ways to find out why your 10GBE connected NAS is not giving you 1 GB or 10 gigabits per second actual real world performance. I'm sure there's ones I've missed. Again, if you have come up with barriers that you've come across before on your resolutions, stick them in the comments below. I'll pin them as much as I can, or I'll try and pin them all into one super comment for other users to enjoy. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. As I say, we do support sections here on NAS Compares all the time. We've got a free version. We've got a fast track system. Use whichever one's appropriate to you, and I'll link them in the description below. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.